Morning, everyone. I hope everybody's having a good conference here in very rainy New York City. My name is Cris Kimbrough. I'm with SKBM Smart Technology, and I'm very happy to be here today with this fabulous panel to talk about the evolving landscape of smart building in multifamily, which is really evolving quite rapidly, and I'm just trying to keep up. So we've got some awesome experts on the panel with us today, and I'd like for them to go ahead and introduce themselves and take a minute.
Sure. So my name is DiBenedetto. I'm the CIO at Northland Investment. We're a owner-operator in the multifamily space, over 80 properties and over 26,000 apartments.
Hi, I'm Andrew Kusminsky. I'm the CEO of Gigstreem. We're a managed Wi-Fi provider. We serve 60,000 units across the entire country.
Hi, I'm Susan Gerock. I'm the Chief Information Officer at Elme Communities, based in Bethesda, Maryland. We're a publicly traded real estate investment trust. We have 28 multifamily communities, about 9,400 doors in the DC and Atlanta markets.
Good morning. I'm Andrew Beach. I'm the Senior Vice President of Community Technology and Innovation for Mill Creek Residential. So we develop, build, own, and operate throughout the country.
Awesome. So you see we've got some various viewpoints up here on the stage today. I think this is going to be an exciting one. I think my timer's not working, someone. So we are, technology is constantly changing. One of the terms that I absolutely hate is future-proof. I don't think really anything is future-proof, but we're all striving to put technologies in place and keep up with what's going to be the best for our business. And so we're here today to really talk about, what kind of considerations need to go into making those technology decisions. And I think a lot of times, we owner operators have, often will think tactically about strategy, but around technology rather. But really, I think, as we move forward and with so many different technologies out there in the marketplace, we need to start thinking more strategically about how we deploy these technologies. So I'm hoping that this team here today can help us get us along that route to thinking a little more strategically about smart building in multifamily. And I would like to just clarify that smart building and not smart home. So this encompasses a lot more than a smart home installation here today. So the first question is to set the stage, and this is a loaded one. and I'd like to hear from everyone. It's what is a smart building? So this morning, and I think I did this when we talked a couple of weeks ago, I just did a quick Google search for smart building definition because it's such fun because there's no two definitions that are alike. So tech to enable efficiencies, buildings that communicate, buildings that deliver actionable information, integrated systems within the building. So starting right here with Mike, what's a smart building?
So for us, I think it's important that we connect smart building to the way that we market the property. And in a lot of ways, we try to connect that to what does it mean to the resident, right? Resident first in that space. And so for us, smart building is any of the, I'll call it amenities or areas that can provide value to that resident experience when they're in those spaces. There is a lot of technology that they'll touch in their apartments, but that also extends to amenity areas, fitness areas, clubhouse areas as well. So we tend to focus at Northland on that apartment space, the space they spend the most time in, as well as connectivity. So managed wireless is a big area of focus for us as well.
So you're really focused with smart building on improving that tenant experience and tenant retention then? Okay, thank you.
Yes, I previously was in the data center world, and I like to think about smart buildings, especially in the residential space, as sort of like a microcosm of the data center world, where a smart building is really just a really small, very well-connected building that has full connectivity throughout the entire site, like this stepping away from the thought process that a provider comes in and they get door fees or some of these legacy agreements where they're just selling individualized triple play services. It's about actually creating that data center like infrastructure at the building. And what I mean by that is when you think about the core infrastructure at the data center, these now become small sort of like edge compute capable sites that can really provide all of the infrastructure necessary for all of those smart systems.
So I think what you're saying is like that connectivity piece is like the foundation of a
It
smart
is the
building.
fundamental
Like
foundational
if you don't have that,
infrastructure,
like
yeah.
where, you can't connect a lot of the other technology you're trying to enable. So
Yeah,
you've got to get
absolutely.
that nailed first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, obviously I'm somewhat biased because that's what we do, but I think that is like, when you think about how telecommunications works at that, and as real estate investment professionals or real estate professionals, I think you can all respect that physical layer is really where it all starts, right? So getting that foundational infrastructure in first is fundamental.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I think that plays across verticals in real estate. Like I think if you went into one of the CRE sessions this morning and said that you wouldn't, nobody would be surprised by that.
Nobody would boo
statement.
me out of the room.
No one would boo you. No one would boo you out of the room. Yeah, it is foundational. So Susan, how about you?
I think I have a very different take. I think it depends, and it depends on the class of building that you have. A Class A building is going to be different from a smart building standpoint than a Class B or a Class C. I also think it is very focused on the type. Is it a garden style? Is it high rise in a city? But I think for us, what's most important is what does that building tell you about the people who live there, who want to live there, and how to really optimally run that building? To me, it's the data that you're getting that allows you to make the best business decisions is what makes a building smart.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things about smart building as we're moving forward. We are gathering all of this data, and I think we're still at a point where we're not the greatest at using it. So there's just, you're enabling all of this technology, and I think, I'm talking to a lot of people recently who are, trying to bring all of that data together into something that's actionable. And so that's where a lot of my focus has been recently on how do we get there.
Yeah.
Andrew?
I mean, to kind of build on what Susan was saying, like if I'm defining a smart building, it's less about what's present or the devices. It's about basically, is there an automation? Is processes like, if we have a smart thermostat, does that smart thermostat perform actions on its own based on information that's given, based on that data? So if someone moves out, does it go to a vacancy mode? That starts to define a smart building for me. Does if we have leak sensors, do those leak sensors cause an action? Are we now more informed and more proactive because of the data that we're getting from our buildings? That starts to define the smart building for me. If I think about kind of taking smart building, I kind of put it into two camps. You have the resident experience, and then you have like operational IoT. And so when we're thinking about smart building, a lot of that focus is on operational IoT. How do we use the systems that we're investing in at a community to make that community proactive in its maintenance, in its actions, in its efficiencies? It needs to start to operate some on its own and inform those decisions.
Yeah, I think proactive is a key word there. Is we can and use these technologies to enable proactive approaches to things like maintenance that we haven't been able to do in the past. And I don't want to go into AI, but that's coming. And so there is there is a lot to be done with technology that kind of transforms the way you deal with managing an apartment building if we can all get there. And I think the other thing that was interesting listening to the panel is it kind of the definition of smart building. I think Andrew B, you said it. I got two Andrews. I'm sorry. I think you said it's kind of depends on what use cases you're trying to enable. I mean, I don't think any of us in this building would say sticking a Nest thermostat on the wall is going to make it a smart building. But you do have to think through maybe a smart building for a garden style. To your point, Susan. In Omaha is different than what smart building is going to be for a high rise in Manhattan. So it is very much, and that's one of the things that throughout my career in technology, I've always tried to pay attention to is, and if I say this, everybody in the room is going to moan, but they're all snowflakes. And so you do have to be able to tailor a solution to that particular property, that particular use case. So smart building is, if anybody was looking for a definitive definition, they're not getting it today. So just to move on from that hot topic, so you got the entire market of multifamily out there, new development, fits and starts. We've got a tremendous amount of retrofits. And I mean, I think that all of the technology providers in the room and at this show, understand the importance of being able to accommodate that retrofit market. But for those of you on the real estate side, I mean, where are you spending your energy? Like, I know I've seen in the past, like new dev gets a lot of technology and it's less expensive to put in. You're going to do it on the front end. You know that you're going to, you know what you're trying to solve for. And then the retrofit market becomes much more difficult. So where are you all putting your energy right now? Is it retrofit by just the fact that there are so many of them?
I think you hit on something important there, right? I mean, I think we all have the experience to know that there's a huge difference between retrofit and new build. The amount of money, the amount of effort, the number of curveballs. From a retrofit standpoint, most of our efforts have gone towards kind of as needed, like leak detection, and sometimes like energy automations. And I think that's gotten a lot easier with the advent of LoRa and some of these newer technologies that have longer ranges that allow more simple operational IoT type devices to communicate through that. So I think that's making things a little bit easier. And then, obviously it's great when we can do design from the ground up because we can really build that infrastructure like Andrew was talking about earlier.
Yeah, we in our portfolio have a lot more brownfield than ground up development that we're working through. So we have to retrofit in more scenarios. But to those curveballs, I think we've seen that you have to be proactive about understanding some of the potential risks. Do you have considerations like cellular signal that's weak in particular areas? Do you have you're connecting a brand new thermostat. Is it a older mechanical system? How will that react? And so we do our best to take, I'd say, a cautious approach, go through the evaluation process thoroughly before taking on. But then once we do decide to take on a project, we try to fully implement in those scenarios as well, even in the retros.
To that point, do you find, one of the things with retrofits is you do have a lot of technology already in place. It may not be the greatest technology, but you've got stuff that maybe you're not going to rip and replace. So what's your process like that for retrofits, for evaluating what you've already got there and then kind of moving into decision making about where we're going to rip and replace, when we're going to add?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges we've seen is around access control systems that historically have been in place for a long, long time. They function, and the need for replacement is connected more towards, I'll say, operations in a lot of ways than it is toward the resident experience. So, but that's also connected to, okay, on the door that is to their apartment, that has a lot bigger benefit to the resident, assuming that we're now not creating, I'd say, multiple credentials for them. Mm-hmm. So in buildings where we have a common credential for maybe it's two different systems, but for their apartment door and their sort of exterior door, not putting in a system where all of a sudden now the resident experience is bifurcated and you have a fob for one door and a pin for another door and an app for a different door. We don't want to create that disjointed experience for people when they're entering our communities. So those are the kinds of considerations when we have existing tech that we have to deal with.
Susan,
we are focused on retrofit in our communities. We don't do a tremendous amount of ground up development, but like others have said, it has to be very thoughtful. It has to pencil out. It has to make sense. Where is going to be the return on a pretty significant capital investment when you do these retrofits? And I think too, it's what does the market expect? And I always use the example of, for those in the room that can remember, at one time, only luxury cars had airbags. And if you got an airbag on a Honda, you paid extra for it. Or maybe you only got it on the driver's side or something like that. Well, today, every car has airbags. And at one time, only the very high-end luxury Class A had a lot of this smart building technology available. And it's getting to the point that no matter what class you are, you may still be expecting a smart door lock or smart access. And it's going to be a driver that eventually owners are going to have to make these investments because it's going to be what the consumer expects.
So you're thinking it's going to become table stakes?
And I think even to kind of build on what you were saying, Susan, is that it is becoming table stakes. And I think access is one of the absolute first places we look when we're looking at a retrofit or a community through like an acquisition. But I think the way to kind of view it in two ways is that it's table stakes from a resident expectation standpoint, and then it also enables efficiencies like self-guided touring. And if you have a large property over 100 acres, you're talking about the ability to know that your model home on the far side is locked up at the end of the day without teams, and not leaving it unlocked overnight after self-guided touring. Like, there's a lot of efficiencies and that we can point to that then help kind of build the value proposition beyond like just needing resident engagement for it. It's actually the entire community operating in a more smart fashion, to our kind of original question.
Yeah, I think I have a follow-up there, because so we're talking about, I mean, Susan, you mentioned the dreaded return on investment. And then Andrew, you're talking about like where do we put these technologies? And so one of the things that I was thinking about was, are you actually seeing these efficiencies? Are the providers helping you see those efficiencies post-install in a retrofit? Or like, are the self-guided tours actually playing out? Are you seeing energy savings? There's this promise of smart building. Are we there?
I think, yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, but anecdotally, like Susan said very early on, there's so much that depends on the class, the area, the size of the community, the needs of the area. So when it's deployed in the appropriate place, we're seeing those efficiencies. But it's not one answer to everything. There is no silver bullet. There is no do this everywhere approach. Yeah. So when those line up, when it's put in the right technologies are being used at the right communities, we're seeing those. We are seeing lower energy bills in the right places. We're seeing with leak detection, we're catching damages before they grow. And we are seeing efficiencies with self-guided touring in those larger communities, garden style or single family rental. So yes, in the right cases, but I can't say it broadly.
Yeah, I just think there needs to be a lot more discussion about that. I think that we're seeing pockets of success with smart building in multifamily, but there's, I don't think we're seeing a tremendous number of case studies yet that really get that point across. So, Andrew, did you want to tell us, from
absolutely.
the infrastructure side, what are you seeing?
I just want to dovetail on something that you were just talking about a little bit, and then I'll go into that. But I think the efficiencies question is a question that I've been asking a lot. Especially recently with some recent press releases. But around that, I think that it's probably more important at this point for the owners to be focused on the customer experience and the changes that occur as it relates to all of the IoT that goes into buildings. Efficiencies, I think, hopefully will come and hopefully will be measured. But there, and I think that there will be an impact. But right now, I think the focus should be on customer experience. Related to retrofits versus ground up construction, we're going to build 40,000, 45,000 units, 45,000 doors this year. I would say 40 of those 45,000 are retrofits. 5,000 are probably ground up, somewhere in that neighborhood. I would say yes, it's gotten easier, and a lot of it's dependent upon really strong processes and designs, and putting the time and effort into it. But you're always going to find issues, impenetrable bedrock or asbestos, right? Like there will always be issues that need to be remediated that are just unforeseen and very difficult to figure out at the beginning of those processes. And I think that there has to be constant communication, really, really good design, really good partnership with the owners that you're working with in order to create those efficiencies, because it is a really expensive investment, right? It's like there's NOI and there is absolutely ROI on these investments, but not when the efficiencies go completely out of whack and get super crazy. So you have to be smart about when you're doing retrofits, but like at the same time, it's highly dependent upon the relationship between the vendor as well as the owner, and making sure that there's constant communication and, an open relationship as it relates to that.
Yeah, because I think we've, particularly with that connectivity piece and retrofit, it does become, it's a labor intensive process, and you are in tenant spaces, and you're not in for a minute, you're in for longer than that. So it does become, but it is again vital. So it's kind of the devil you have to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, we've been yelled at for the construction issues happen. It is intensive construction, right? Sprinkler lines break and water floods an apartment, or you walk into a unit and someone's figurine falls off that was glass and it was their grandmother's and they're flipping out, right? Like, you've got to deal with those small issues, but again, like that constant communication, planning, and building those efficiencies throughout that process.
So what you're telling me is you'd rather do new builds.
New builds, are easier definitively, but we've gotten really, really good at the brownfield construction because we do so many of them. Yeah, I mean, greenfield's easier. There's nobody, you're not messing with somebody's life, right?
I mean, is brownfield getting any easier, or?
It depends on the building. I mean, I think Susan said that really well, as well as
Yeah.
Andrew, right? It just depends on the building. We have had properties that were extremely difficult. We've got a property right now that we're dealing with in California. It's 1,000 units, garden style, 20 different buildings, and it's all outside plant construction, like trenching. You're upending all of the landscaping to do. It's challenging sometimes, and sometimes you're really lucky and you get a nice mid-rise, high-rise in New York City, and it's just straight up the riser stack. I mean, you never know.
Well,
And
and what
I-
you're, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say quickly, and I think a couple things on return. We try to be really targeted in terms of, can we find a use case where it's both beneficial to the resident and to the operation, right? So smart locks is a good example. There's operational benefit there from a maintenance efficiency perspective, and then also the residents, see that as an amenity. There's plenty of survey data out there that there is an amenity value that residents are willing to pay for that today. It hasn't transitioned totally to table stakes just yet. So we've identified those. We think connectivity is another one. We think that, whether they're getting it from us or whether they're going to call up the provider and get it themselves, like, residents value connectivity in the building. And so we make that as easy as possible if we can have managed wireless where they come, move in, sign up, and within minutes they're online. There's no sort of this process of calling the provider, getting something shipped to you, transitioning accounts, dealing with this. Like, there's none of that happens. So if we can
dealing
find
with
those,
the customer service. Yeah.
so if we can find those benefits, that's where we see returns are a lot easier to come by, when we can find operational benefit alongside the resident benefit.
Gotcha. Andrew, do you have something?
Yeah, I was just gonna kind of tail on to what Andrew was saying of when we're able to do managed Wi-Fi, right? Being able to put that infrastructure in enables so much more than it makes. If you're talking about like the ease of retrofit, when you're able to build the connectivity foundation, then the rest of the retrofit layers so much more seamlessly. And so focusing on that foundational piece of infrastructure in a retrofit, that piece enables everything else to be much more seamless and functional and reliable.
And that kind of leads us into our next question. Once we have this foundational layer in place and we have our devices hanging off this foundational layer, all these IoT devices, and we'll get to integrations in a minute, but one of the things you have to be really concerned about is cybersecurity, because now you've got devices connected to the cloud. You've got potential security leaks all over the place. And so, we've all heard the stories about how Target got in through the HVAC system or something like that. I can't remember exactly, but it's, you do have to very much worry about, as you add all these additional devices onto your network, what you're going to do about cybersecurity. So I would love for the panel to share. I know from prior experience, if you're the bigger owner operators have a very specific security process that they put vendors through, where they look at things like SOC 2 Type 2 compliance, and there's a very specific process, but not everybody out there has that level of sophistication or the resources to address cybersecurity in the way that which we probably need to do more and more we definitely need to do more and more going forward. So how are you all addressing cybersecurity issues as you roll out smart building?
Well, I think the big thing is certainly privacy. And I think resident privacy is key. And their information, they have to know that we, as their landlord, are going to protect their information and treat it respectfully. And so much of that comes with working with the individual vendors, understanding what information they're collecting, how they're storing it, what they know, what they're exchanging with other vendors, who else is in their supply chain. So understanding not only who you're dealing with, but who are they dealing with, and making sure that you can vet that out. And also including really strong structure in your contracts with those vendors. I mean, we've definitely had vendors that we have looked at and had to say, we can't do business with this person because they are not secure enough. They don't have the practices in place that make us feel comfortable introducing this into our architecture.
Andrew, Mike? Mike, I think you had a lot to say about this.
I'll echo what Susan said. I think that on the contract side, you just have to be, we tell all vendors, we treat all vendors the same. We have the same level of expectation for them that we have of our own internal staff. I think to the point made is that we take that responsibility seriously. We expect all our partners to as well. And we communicate that. We also communicate in a fashion where, because there's many structures. So depending upon, there might be a sign-up process that the resident will go through directly with the vendor. We expect that process is going to happen in a responsible way, even if that relationship is direct between our resident and that vendor. We brought that vendor to our community. We take a responsibility there. So from a security practices perspective, before you engage, I think it's important to make sure that they have the appropriate, not just that they send you the information, but that they have a contractual commitment to continue to do so, to continue to operate in a manner that is necessary to provide security. And I also think that, we also collectively need to explain to vendors that benefit extends to all of their customers. So it can be hard. There's a lot of startup vendors. There's a lot of vendors that are getting going. We will work with vendors at different stages along the way to make sure that it's done in a manner that SOC 2 certifications are time consuming. They're expensive to be done, but that doesn't alleviate the need to secure data, to have external audits. So there can be steps along that journey or that path that vendors can take to assure owners and operators that data for their residents is secure.
Absolutely. Andrew?
Yeah, I think the one thing I'd just kind of say to all this, and it's probably kind of a little bit of a tangent here, but is essentially from my experience and kind of path through things, I originally started with building the community technology team in our IT department. And I think there was a lot of value in going through building out and the work under IT. Now we are structured under operations and property management. And for us, it's really strategic because that allows us to really represent the end customer all the way through the construction and development process. But those relationships that were formed within the IT group, within risk management, are really key to bringing all the stakeholders together as a part of the process and to communicate more rather than moving fast. And so anytime we're working with vendor vetting, it is always just really critical to bring in all the different departments and stakeholders and make sure everyone has had the opportunity to weigh in, to go through the vetting, to be a part of that process so that these decisions are made broadly and not quickly.
Well, that's probably putting the fear into every supplier in the room if you're saying it's got to go slowly. But I do
want to know
understand.
what Andrew thinks as a supplier.
Sure, Susan. I'm happy to answer. So we started, when we started, we had nothing in place. And I think that one of our first larger customers was publicly traded, and they slipped into the contract, to your point, they slipped into the contract that you have to be SOC 2 compliant by this date. And to Michael's point, it is really expensive and really time consuming. We've just finished off, we thought we'd get away with CIS 18, and the public guys were like, no, you need SOC 2. So we've just finished the process for SOC 2, and now we're in the reporting stage. And we should have our SOC 2 compliance by the end of this year, beginning of next year. So, yes.
Well, and I think it's also, to Susan's point about, she said, certain vendors, you have to be upfront with them about that. Like, that's a differentiator. It's not always just in the economics of a particular deal. It's in these other components that, you might not see the return on your investment, but you're protecting your investment by going with a partner that has these practices in place.
Yeah, it's risk management. I mean, when you get down to it, and I think this year in particular, with insurance costs going through the roof, that risk management is a very hot topic. So, I mean, I think cybersecurity, it needs to be front and center. There's a group, it's a nonprofit, Building Cybersecurity, which I can encourage everybody to look into, which is a nonprofit working on cybersecurity, and they've got a lot of experts on board. I know some of them they're great to work with. So if anybody needs any tips on that, please reach out to me. But Andrew, you said something interesting. Andrew B. You said something interesting about bringing those stakeholders to the table, and I think that's really understanding how that technology gets used is very important. And also, like, with understanding the real estate use of it, I think a lot of times when you're talking to technology people, they don't understand they don't understand like the day-to-day of how that technology is going to get used. And so it becomes problematic when you try to deploy it, because that part hasn't been thought of. You've really got to get everybody in the room to understand what you're trying to deploy and what benefit it's going to give to them, because I think you've got to do things like get staff buy-in at the property level
And construction buy-in. And I mean,
Yeah.
there's so many aspects to, we don't know everything that every piece of what goes into contracts, deployments, everything. So bringing in all those stakeholders, making sure we understand what construction's process is and how it's going to impact is huge, right? All the different groups.
Yeah, I was thinking that brownfield, right, these retrofits, vintage is not a panacea. So just having something that you may have acquired that was built within the last 5 to 10 years does not necessarily mean that they put in all the core infrastructure when they built the property. So, it's, again, back to that assessment phase. Like, you really have to take a quick step back to make sure that you're taking a really deep look into what the building architecture looks like.
Yeah, and that's where the pace comes in. That's where it becomes important to really look at what you're trying to solve for. So the next question was actually about connectivity, but I think we've already touched on that. I mean, we have, I think, probably beaten it into the ground that you got to get the connectivity into place first. Are there any, though, particular strategies? I know we've got Andrew here with managed Wi-Fi. I'm a huge fan and have been for a long time, because it does enable that instant on. It also enables Wi-Fi calling across the property, which is a huge deal as cell signals. 5G is awesome, but it does not penetrate buildings. So there's a lot of consumer side interest in having that managed Wi-Fi in place. But are there any particular strategies around connectivity and getting that in place? Are there any technologies you're looking at as we maybe move away from the retail area, the retail era of Wi-Fi?
You went from my perspective. I mean, I think we're all in on the deployment of Wi-Fi infrastructure at the properties. I mean, yes, it solves a lot of those problems. I think actually probably better to hear from your all's perspectives, like what you're thinking.
So, I mean, this is not the most fun side of the discussion in terms of like technology and things, but if we're talking about evolving smart buildings, right, and how continuously changing this space is, I think I hate to say it's as simple as, but especially in Greenfield, it's pathways, it's the core drilling, it's the ability to bring in, sure, we have managed Wi-Fi today, but we need multiple pathways out to the street so that we're flexible for the future. I think, you talked about future proofing not being a real word, but it's about building that flexibility, both in the contract agreements and and with providers, that yes, we have a plan for today, but we need the pathways, we need the design, we need the microduct or the Smurf tubes to the homes so that we're not cutting sheetrock ever again, and we can bring whatever, where we evolve to in the industry or where regulations steer us. And so, to me, a lot of it isn't the necessarily like technology portion of it that's so important, but it's investing in that flexibility throughout the building so that we can pivot and adapt and deploy so that we're not dealing with the retrofit issues we deal with today in the future. We can learn from the challenges that we have at our retrofit communities and plan better that our future communities, while we may not know what that answer is today, we have the ability to do whatever that is when we get there.
I think that's a really good point. I would say like the concept of not cutting corners, right? I mean, like like oftentimes you hear providers talk about, oh, we'll value engineer that particular property. As soon as you hear that, red flag should go up, because to Andrew's point, like you know, this is the investment in the future infrastructure within your building to support all of these technologies that are growing like crazy. You know, we said fundamental or foundational infrastructure, right? That this is, you're laying the groundwork for that to happen. So.
Yeah, I had a colleague once who made a very good living doing nothing but reviewing plans to make sure all the conduit would accommodate future technologies. That's all he did, was look at conduit on plans for new dev. It's important. And you know, I think the closest to future proof you're going to get is fiber. And so if you can get that fiber in the building and you've got that all, you know, you're planning that into a new dev, you're a long way towards getting to smart building in the long run. So
I think there's also an aspect of treating our agreements even similar to our infrastructure in that flexibility. So as we're planning for like telecom agreements, are we contemplating different avenues that this, or future states of what this may need to be and how we may need to adjust those, and then kind of pre-negotiating. And so it is challenging because, you know, in some of these cases, we're negotiating essentially 2 to 3 models in an agreement so that we have, because when you're negotiating an initial agreement is when essentially you have a blank slate. And so using that opportunity to build future flexibility up front it's both challenging, but it's also kind of taking that similar approach to how do we give ourselves as many opportunities and as much flexibility to preserve what we initially hoped for and planned for when we built this community.
Point taken, and it is those agreements, and I'm gonna contact you offline and find out how you get through that. But it is one of those tactical bits of work that you have to do when you're putting smart building in place, and those agreements can be very complex, and you do have to really rely on people that know what your end goals are, that really understand the real estate side, so that they don't get you into trouble with tech firms, because you will see, you know, there are. It is more complex than probably people imagine, getting those agreements in place. So I think we've kind of touched on it. You know, I don't want to say single pane of glass, but app fatigue, and, you know, bringing the data together, and how do you work with the data? How do you make sure that everything is integrated into, as many things are integrated into one system as possible, so that you're easing, it's ease of use for the staff. You're taking, you're creating efficiencies. You're taking work off of your property staff. You're, you know, you're improving tenant experience. And so a lot of that relies on integrating pieces of technology into one platform. And I know that in my journey through multifamily smart building, that, or, you know, at first I was like, I want people to integrate with everything. And then I saw some of those integrations and I'm like, I don't want people to do that anymore. And then now I'm kind of leaning back the other way. I'm like, maybe if we get some good integrations, this could be great. We can be really flexible. You know, if you have the right integrations in place, and, you know, if you've got retrofits, you can, you know, integrate things that are already in place and maybe not have to rip out all the components. So what is everybody seeing? Are we still seeing challenges with integrating new technologies? I know I've seen a couple of risk mitigation technologies recently that aren't integrated into anything else, and I'm dying to deploy them, but I'm like, I gotta find a way to, you know, work with a smart building provider that's gonna, you know, make it so that the staff doesn't have to look at 3 different screens every day. So what's everybody seeing in terms of new technologies and integrations? And do you think companies are like technology providers are more open to integrating now than they have been in the past?
No.
Mic drop.
So we, just even in the last 24 hours sitting in the sessions, how many sessions have you been in? Show of hands where somebody mentioned issues integrating or getting partners to integrate. I imagine that people sat in those sessions, heard multiple speakers say it. I don't know how many sessions we can sit in. This has been an ongoing problem for a number of years. People who have come from outside of the real estate industry don't understand this because many other industries don't have these integration struggles or challenges. But in our industry, it really is. And so whenever we face these challenges, we communicate to vendors that we select them for their service, for their partnership, for their value. We do not select them because they lock us into exclusive contracts or they hold our own data ransom to us as part of a service that we pay for.
That is a problem right there. The data ownership is something that we could probably talk a half an hour on.
And just accessibility, right? That
Yeah.
this sort of gets to the part of, we were talking yesterday about connected buildings versus truly smart buildings. And if you want to take automations and actions, you have to unlock that data. So, you might own the data, but it's no good if you don't have an API to access it and then shuttle it through your processes to somewhere else where it can become even more valuable. And this is how projects get done, because if the only value is in this one locked component, it's much harder to make the business case for the spend. There's a lot of capital usually up front in these projects. It's a lot harder to build that case. It's a lot easier to build it if I can say, well, now that data is unlocked, I can pull it, I can move it, I can do other things, I can take other actions and steps with this.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, again, the data is so important, and I do think a lot of it comes down to getting to a point where we're utilizing it to its best effect. And I would love to hear some more on how, not right now, but on how you're using the data, because I do think that is where people are struggling right now. And like I said, a lot of tech coming out of the woodwork, trying to solve for that problem, and I don't think anybody's quite there yet. But it is part of it's part of when we talk about return on investment, it's part of the return on investment, and it's just very hard to quantify.
I
Susan?
know in one of the sessions yesterday morning, someone asked a question about how do you manage the number of applications that your community teams are having to deal with? And that goes to your concerns about integration and some of the many challenges we have. In fact, I think if you haven't seen it, NMHC did a really good study that was published last fall that noted some companies in the resident journey have over 30 applications that community teams are having to use as part of that entire resident journey. And that's not okay. That doesn't work for the long term. That is not a smart building. That's not a smart system.
And I think we're eventually kind of building a bingo card of words that lack definition, and we can put smart building on there and integrations, and right, it's just it gets thrown around. It's a quick conversation piece, but as we're all talking about, the actual need to understand when you say integrated, what do you mean? Which way is it going? Who owns the information? And then how is that going to inform? And does the right, if you go back to that cybersecurity question, at the end of the day, which partner then holds that and what's their, risk profile, all comes into play with how, because sometimes honestly, there may be an integration that we don't use because it's not necessary. And it doesn't provide that much efficiency, but it provides more risk than it does benefit. And so it's we do understand that two partners integrate and we use both partners, but we may not always use the integration they have. And so each of those are evaluated kind of on an individual basis as to the quality of the integration, how proven it is, where is it being used today, who's holding that information based on having that integration. What other information do you now have access to because of what you're pulling? And so, all of this goes into this landscape of how we kind of navigate that word integration and what's truly happening. And then making that trade-off between an in-house system that there may be an in-house system that does 90% of what a longstanding kind of best in breed partner does. And so is it worth something that's native and not integrated to get most of the way there, if you will, versus everything you could possibly want? You know, those are a lot of trade-offs we evaluate.
So does the onus fall on you to make those kinds of decisions about integrations? Or are you relying on your tech partners? Like if you're saying we need these 5 integrations, is that a decision that you have gathered stakeholders internally and have decided that's how this technology is going to work best for us? Or are you going to a technology provider and saying, here are my use cases, where do I need integrations? Like how does that working for you?
Both. It's both, everything, nothing. It's really about what I want to do is see, one, I wouldn't want an integration that only we're going to use, because there's challenges if you have a custom integration that isn't being supported broadly. So generally, I wouldn't want an integration developed that is like a unique use case for just us. I want to know that it's going to be used broadly, so that it's going to be tested, so it's going to get improved, so it's going to get supported and evolve over time. So there's a lot that goes into that decision about which integrations we push and pursue and which ones we live with kind of the current state of things. I'd say that's probably one of the big factors, is making sure that the community at large is going to partake in something.
It's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought of that before, but that's really interesting. Andrew, from the managed Wi-Fi perspective, you're not integrating with a lot of other technologies.
I mean, I was just talking about this yesterday, right? It's they make it just as difficult for us. I mean, you know, I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, do you integrate with this PMS or this PMS or this PMS? And it's challenged. I mean, they make it really expensive, extremely cumbersome, and then everybody wants to build their own app and their own portal. I mean, like, you know, I can see why it's so difficult, because, you know, my app and my portal is better than your app and your portal, right? But yeah, there needs to be some railway tracks that are built, and somebody needs to muscle up, I think.
There's been a little bit of, I'm sorry, Mike, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, because from an experience perspective, we think about, you know, resident retention, resident experience, you know, just the event of move-in touches almost every single smart system in the building, right? I mean, there are obviously systems that, you know, that may have less interaction with on a daily basis, but every system is going to require some level of provisioning. And the way when we talk to our teams about when you want those integrations is, do you want to be manually configuring all those user accounts in all those systems because no integration exists? So it is beneficial to the site teams, putting it in context that they'll understand why that integration is beneficial. That helps the technology teams go out and say why we need these integrations. And we also do try to be cognizant of partners need to understand whether those integrations are broadly applicable across owner-operators, buyers.
Yeah, and you're talking about the move-in process, and I've actually been on teams onboarding properties before, and the number of integrations required is staggering, and it does cross over from smart building into the OT, and so you've got to make sure that all those pieces are coming together, and it is, I mean, anybody can automate that. There's $1 million idea right there. So we're getting close to time here. I just want to, let's see if we've got time for one more question. Just one more question around, actually, I think I'd rather hear a long answer to the last question, which is, what are the learnings and best practices you have around smart buildings? And I think I think it's a loaded question, because we just talked about at the beginning, how many definitions there are for smart buildings. So how do you decide what best practices are if you don't know what a smart building is? So I think, everybody's kind of, working their way through it still. But I would love to hear how everybody is, are there, I know as I've worked through things, there are little, tips that I come up with, and I'm like, oh, I've got to remember to do that next time. Is there anything your words of wisdom for the crew here around what best practices are? I think, Andrew, one of yours would be get the stakeholders together, but I'd love to hear from everybody about that.
I mean, I'll just then finish on that. So yeah, getting the stakeholders together, but it's about the flexibility. It's about creating options for yourself long-term. And that is, from operational IoT to the way a building functions and grows and ages, the way we think about from the ground up, we're always building flexibility in so that without going, right, because like you can't have access, you can't go too far because we have to do that. So finding that right place where you have opportunity, building yourself opportunity long-term, I think is kind of a key principle to keep in mind with all of your stakeholders giving you their input, and that you've got broad scale buy-in and input to bring in other voices wiser than ourselves.
I think it's challenging, but I think standardization, as much as you possibly can across your portfolio, is key. Give you a great example. So we've been really looking at package locker data for information, mostly focused on staffing at our communities. Do you know how many different package locker vendors we have across our communities? It's very hard to bring all that data together, and they collect data differently. For example, one company is very, very detailed, where surprisingly, Amazon, not very detailed. We don't get a whole lot of information out of Amazon's package lockers. And I think, it's by nature of the business. When you're acquiring what's there. But if you have an opportunity to standardize, I think you're going to get so much more out of your smart building investment.
I'll just kind of dovetail onto that a little bit in terms of standardization. Going back to the question about, is brownfield retrofit getting easier a little bit? But the standardization, we always find that it's easier when we're partnering with an owner that has multiple properties and wants to build a standard service with the same model at multiple buildings. We get into a cadence with them. We understand each other. The communication gets better. It's always rough on the first couple, right? But then by the time you get to the second or third or fourth, it just gets easier and easier and easier, and everybody knows what to expect. I think that's one thing. And then the other thing I would like to touch on is pay for redundancy.
Yeah.
Pay for redundancy. I know that you all love NOI, and I want you all to have as much NOI as you want, but pay for the redundancy.
I think that's what you're saying there is technology is brand, right? You're putting this, you're actually branding your properties, with certain technologies if you go the route of standardization. And then Mike, you are.
And I think
You're up.
to that point, I think it's being thoughtful about how the resident will perceive this smart building, right? To that idea of brand and how you're presenting yourselves to your residents as a community. Are they going to value the technology that you're putting in there? So I think it's being thoughtful up front, engaging all the various stakeholders to understand that component specifically, not just how will it work from an implementation or operations perspective, or can you grow revenue, but will this impact other components like that move-in experience, like that desire to stay and be, sort of drive retention rates higher.
I think that's one of the most important things when evaluating technology vendors is what their training and support looks like, especially when, we have a lot of turnover in property staff. So that constant retraining is needed. You need the buy-in from the property staff. I mean, I've been to buildings where, you've got a lot of technology installed, nobody's using it, because you don't have buy-in from anyone. So it does become, vitally important. Again, stakeholders, communication, you're really getting that buy-in in order to make you're never going to have an ROI if you don't have the buy-in. So I think that's all for today. Did anybody have any questions? We've got 1 minute left.
When we talk about smart buildings, there are three major components of it. There's resident amenities, there's operational efficiency, and sustainability. If you have to prioritize these as per, from point of view of someone who has to write a check for a vendor, how do you prioritize these?
So for Northland, it's resident first, and I think we would look at the other two as hopefully supporting the first, for sure.
Start with the managed Wi-Fi, of course.
I certainly think the resident comes first because that's where, you want resident satisfaction. You also see that as a revenue opportunity.
Yeah, and I think though they all do go hand in hand, but I do think that there is, as we look at operational efficiency, that can improve resident experience as well. And so, I think you have to kind of weigh each opportunity against all three maybe, as we think about it.
And I'm sure there's somebody over there telling me to get off stage. I just can't see. But thank you, everybody, for joining us here today. I hope this was interesting, and have a good show.